Welcome to Healthcare IT Today. I'm John Lynn, together with my colleague and friend, Colin Hung. The world of technology and healthcare are ever-changing in new and novel ways, and that's why we love this stuff. So join us as we discuss the latest healthcare and health IT news, meshed together in new ways, which help generate ideas and new perspectives. Plus, we'll have a little fun along the way. On today's episode, we'll be doing a healthcare regulation edition of our popular buy or sell, where we look at a topic, we decide, are we buying it or are we selling it? You may remember it if you've been on some of our past episodes. So today's episode is sponsored by the Chirpy Bird Health IT Consulting Company. Learn more about them at chirpybirdllc.com, and be sure to follow the show on Twitter at the hashtag HITSM, and our personal accounts at TechGuy and at Colin_Hung. Plus, check out our 13 years of health IT blog content at healthcareittoday.com. Are you buying or selling?
It's a good question. It's a good question, John. We got some pretty interesting topics we're going to talk about on the buy and sell episode, which is, as you just said, proven to be one of our most popular. So I'm looking forward to it today. So we're going to be talking about whether or not the U.S. needs a national patient identifier. We're going to discuss buy or sell whether or not UnitedHealth is a better home for patients like me. We're going to talk about de-identified patient data and whether or not that in itself is a misnomer. And should EHRs be regulated by the FDA?
My goal is to start a fight with you, Colin. Is that possible?
Well, that'll
do
be
Canadians
a challenge.
fight at all?
we do, but there has to be a puck and some ice involved.
Never about regulation. Okay.
Never about regulation. All right, John. So let's get this thing started. Does the U.S. are you buying or selling the fact that the U.S. needs a national patient identifier?
I'm definitely buying this. I know there's different risks associated with the national patient ID, and there's privacy concerns that people have, but my feeling is that all of those privacy concerns are essentially concerns that we have today, even when we don't have a national patient ID. So I don't think adding a national patient ID adds any sort of additional privacy concerns that don't already exist today. It's slightly more, I mean, I see a little bit, but it's so slight. And I think the potential benefits of a national patient ID are much better. I think we have to be careful. It's certainly not a panacea, and kind of in the same way that I don't think the national patient ID causes all sorts of privacy violations. I also don't think a national patient ID solves all our identification problems. But I think it's a good move forward. I think it was bad legislation when they said that the government couldn't even spend money thinking about it, and I'm glad that it will hopefully change.
That's an interesting one. Coming from a land where we do supposedly have a national patient identifier.
Great White North.
we up here in Canada still have all the same interoperability problems. We do not have the ability or portability of records that people think would naturally come with a patient ID. We still, as researchers, work with some researchers up here. They still have the problem of, deduping patient records and things, because even though the identifier does come over in certain cases, it's not correct, or, you have to be able to tap into various databases to validate them. Because, for example, I could theoretically get an identifier in Ontario, one province, and get another identifier in another province, but it's the same person. So we still have these problems. So I am buying into the fact that the U.S. needs one. I am not sold on the fact that this is going to make a huge difference right out of the gate for anything. It's just going to take a long time before it becomes rolled out properly and before the rest of the technology catches up.
No, I mean, that's a good point. Everyone thinks, oh, you issue a national patient ID. I mean, we saw this with Medicare. They finally implemented these new cards with an ID and all that, and it's taken a little while for it to actually roll out. And having a national patient identifier is going to take even longer. So even if it does, it pass the House, and hopefully Congress and the President will pass it off as well. But I think it's a good thing. It's a good step forward, and to be honest, it's a little ridiculous that it was stopped in the first place.
Well, I think this is obviously that regulation was a relic of a different time, right? And, back in the, well, I guess the old days when things were paper-based, this kind of identifier, could be very dangerous. I think now in today's world, this is no more dangerous than any other number that we have because it's all electronic. Whether or not it's more or less secure has more to do with the hardware and software and nothing to do with the fact that this ID exists, right?
Yeah, it's
So
an interesting point. I mean, but I think also people have been so scared of sharing the social security number, which could have been a national patient ID, but there was such fear because it's tied to our financial history that it makes sense that we need something else.
yeah, so cool. So we're both buying into this one
With caution.
with caution. I like that. Gotta put that with caution. All right, so move on to the second one. So, is United Healthcare a better home for patients like me? And for those that aren't familiar, Patients Like Me is a community basically that connects patients together with similar rare diseases and conditions where patients can share and exchange information. It was recently sold or being forced to sell. The Chinese company that owned it was forced to sell its stake, and United Healthcare was the buyer. So we moved from a foreign-owned entity now to a payer and device and provider. So,
And their
John,
fear was that the Chinese-owned entity would have access to too much U.S. data that would somehow be an issue for national security. That's what they call it, which feels like a stretch, but okay.
So, are you buying or selling this one, John?
So I guess I'm not buying that it's a better home. So I guess in the end, I'll say no, it's not a better home. But I also am not sure that all of the outrage and all of the fear that many have, that United Health is a bad home. So, I don't think I would take it that far. So I guess, it's not a better home than a Chinese. I also think the fear of that Chinese company somehow accessing information that they could use, that feels a little bit of a stretch, although in this world of Cambridge Analytics and government interference in politics and other things, maybe there is a real fear there. But yeah, so I don't think it's a great home for patients like me, and I hope eventually it rolls off into some other entity. But I also don't think United Health is a bad home for it. I don't think United Health is organized enough to actually leverage patients like me and use it for bad. I think they have so much going on and so many opportunities that there's really not a way, an easy way for them to leverage it to do the harm that most people think they could do if they wanted.
Yeah, I'm selling this one. Mostly not because I don't think United Healthcare, that is a danger. I don't believe that. Like you, I just don't think there's sort of a threat that United Health is going to use that data for some nefarious reason to sell other things to people. I don't think that's their goal. What I'm selling though is, I really don't understand why the government forced the sale in the first place. Especially when you consider that, yes, this is sensitive information, I get it, but the population of people using Patients Like Me was so small compared to, I'll call it, other Chinese technologies, right? Like, how many people are using Huawei phones, right? Like, and how much data are on these phones, and why is there not a fear of, I'm sure there actually is a fear, but there's, it's the same kind of argument to say, well, why aren't we banning those, or why aren't we forcing the sale of, or banning those things? So to me, I think it was really more of obviously a political move. I think it's obvious it could be thought of as related to some of the trade wars that are going on right now. But I mean, there is a little bit of fear about, well, what happens when they get hold of the medical data of these people? Can they blackmail them? Can they use them for something? My point is, if they wanted to do that, they would find a way to do it without owning Patients Like Me anyway. So there's enough public information available on Facebook and other places where you pretty much don't have to do that. So I think I'm selling the idea that the government had to get involved in the sale of this. I think they were right maybe to look at it, but I think the conclusion was a little bit of a stretch. I also don't think that United Healthcare is going to do Patients Like Me a service. I think, unfortunately, because they are so big, I just don't know how much attention they're going to put on it. And therefore, I think over time, it'll just die on the vine a little bit, which is unfortunate because I think Patients Like Me is a great platform.
Yeah, and we'll see how long the founders stick around. I mean, they had a real vision for it that's been powerful, and I think they've been transparent and they've done a good job with it. It's interesting this discussion, especially after just talking about a national patient identifier. It's like, well, we need a national patient identifier to identify patients, but we're afraid that China is going to use this. Let's be honest, Patients Like Me is somewhat crappy data, right? Like, it's not like it's organized with a unique identifier that allows you to understand who that patient is and all of their comorbidities and identify them with their Facebook profile, which allows you to then market to them in some stretch of an imagination to influence the political. I don't know. Like, I mean, we needed a patient identifier, but a Chinese company who may or may not be involved in politics or anything else is somehow going to leverage this kind of unorganized data to influence something that is a national security interest. Yeah, it feels like a stretch.
It does feel like a stretch, especially since, and all the power to them, but there are companies out there that, do this kind of medical research on people, whether it's for, to validate claims or to approve insurance. I mean, there's companies that do this, right?
It's a cheaper way to get it. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. I mean, there's a perfectly legal industry built around getting this information through other channels. Like I said, like through social media, through other records that are publicly available. I mean, it's not, I won't say it's not that hard, but there is a way to get it without having to go out and buy a company, right? Like, there's a lot of other ways to do it. And anyway, it just, to me, that was the start of this whole journey, which was well documented by Christina Farr and CNBC around this sale. I just don't think it was necessary, but hey, we're here now, and let's hope United Healthcare does pour some money into it and keep the Patients Like Me platform running.
Definitely.
And with that, John, we're kind of at the midpoint. So if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Healthcare IT Today with John Lynn and Colin Hung. Today's episode is brought to you by Chirpy Bird. John, do you want to tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so if you don't know about the Chirpy Bird Health IT Consulting Company, it's really run by two amazing women, Joy Rios and Robin Roberts, and they're some of the most well-informed health IT regulation experts you'll find. I always turn to them when I have my questions, and Joy literally has written the book and multiple books on some of the most important health IT regulations, beginning with things like PQRS and then meaningful use, and now MACRA and MIPS, and so she's a real expert and really both of them are real regulation experts. And it doesn't hurt that there's also some of the nicest people on earth too. If you spend time with them, you'll realize this. But along with their consulting company, they also do a great podcast called the HIT Like a Girl podcast, which features women in health IT. So if you want to learn more about them, check out more information about Chirpy Bird Health IT Consulting and also the HIT Like a Girl podcast at the websites chirpybirdllc.com and hitlikeagirlpod.com. You can learn all about their consulting and the podcast. Just great people doing, the hard work of health IT. So check them out.
All right, great group. Topic number 3, John. Are you buying or selling de-identified patient data? And I don't mean literally buying and selling. I mean, are you buying the concept or selling the concept of de-identified patient data?
So this is an interesting one because there's a lot of interesting science and logistics around the concept of de-identified data. And can it be really de-identified? And my good friend Andy Oram loves this topic. He dives into it a lot. And he's made the case to me that in many cases, the reality is you can't de-identify data. There are standards out there that are essentially, make it really hard to re-identify it, and those are valuable, and I think those are worth implementing in a lot of cases. But I guess, and maybe this is my own personal approach to it and personal worldview, is that I think we're in a state where de-identified data doesn't exist. You can make it harder for someone to re-identify the data, but you can't ever purely de-identify the data. So I guess I don't know. Am I buying or selling de-identified patient data? I say go ahead, try to de-identify it. Be thoughtful in how you do it, But at the end of the day, that data is going to be out, and people should be able to share it. People should be allowed to share it. And if it gets re-identified, I think we just have to assume that's what's going to happen with the data. This topic was actually prompted by the recent court case with the hospital that shared some de-identified data with Google, and now they're being sued because the plaintiff is alleging that Google could re-identify the data using the other sources of information they have, which includes the Android phones, which is something I think a lot of people don't think about with Google, right? Is, oh, I know where you've been, I know where you've gone, I know all of that map data and GPS data really informs a lot of people, and you could re-identify or identify who's in that data. So I guess for me, hey, I'm buying that it's good to de-identify data, but I think I'm also buying that we need to learn to accept that no data can truly be de-identified.
I think on this one, John, we are in alignment. I am buying into the need for de-identification. I think you should definitely do what you can to make it difficult. But I think we should also accept the notion that if someone really wants to reconstitute that data back to an individual, you can. We have the technology now, we have the computing power, we have the other sources of information enough to piece together with high confidence who that individual is.
And that's just going to get worse, right? I mean, everything you described is going to get harder. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I think, rather than regulate the de-identification step, I think it's really more on the other side. I think government actually should start to think about, and companies should start thinking about policies around how that data is actually used. So let's assume the data is going to be available, my health data. It shouldn't be used against me in employment, in whether or not I can get a job. It shouldn't be used in whether or not I do. And if a company is found or an organization is found to be doing this, then there should be some sort of penalty. I think unfortunately we're at that side of the equation now. I think trying to stem the genie's out of the bottle. I think trying to plug it back in and make policies around, well, you have to de-identify, you have to do all this stuff, I think is a little bit, it's past. I mean,
that's a regulatory challenge, though, is trying to regulate what is allowed and isn't allowed with data and what's considered discrimination and not. But so, I mean, to me, the first step is just inform me when you're selling my data. So I know who has it, who's bought it, who's been given it, so that then, until we do that, I don't think we can know how people are going to use it to discriminate against us. But at least if you're making me aware, then I could discover, oh, the insurance company tried to discriminate against me because they had access to this data, right? And therefore, then we can make good regulatory policies. But right now we're just guessing at how people are going to do it, and that never makes for good regulation.
No, it's true, and that's the big challenge of and you just mentioned the big challenge, understanding where that data is being used or sold or bought, and how far down that chain it really goes. Because once I sell it to person, if I'm the owner and I sell it to person or company A, where does company A go with it?
Yeah,
where does
they sell it to B and C and D, and
yeah, I mean we do have to solve it, but I think until we do, you're right. I mean, we're never going to get a handle on where and how this data is used or isn't used. So yeah, I'm definitely selling this one. I'm meaning selling the fact that something can really be truly de-identified anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of this recent story I read about pharma pricing, and maybe it's a topic for another another episode. But and just how they had this line that just stuck with me. It said, "When grandma's on her deathbed, nobody worries about price." And I wonder, it's like the pharma industry didn't used to abuse that, and now they are. And so I think there's a lot of other ways that data can be abused. We need to be thoughtful for.
I hear you totally. Let's go to topic number 4. So John, are you buying or selling the fact or the statement that EHRs should actually be regulated by the FDA?
Wouldn't that be awesome? Oh, wait. I mean, like, imagine what would happen if the FDA came out and said, we're going to regulate EHRs. How many EHRs would be put out of business? That's that's a lot to chew on, which is why I think it will never happen. But should they? I'll never forget the time I heard Shahid Shah, our friend and colleague at Netspective Media. he said, I see no reason why the EHRs shouldn't meet the same standard as every other medical device. The risks are similar, and yet they've chosen not to. So, I guess, I get that perspective, but then I also get the innovation perspective and says, well, if it's regulated, which, EHRs are semi-regulated with things like meaningful use of macro, and I think that's been a disaster, as far as actually improving EHRs. I think it's created a standard baseline of that's killed innovation in the EHR world, unfortunately. So I think if the FDA came on board and regulated them even more, it would be even a bigger disaster. We'd see even less innovation, and we would certainly see a slimming of EHR. So that would be interesting, and there might be some value in that regard. But yeah, so I'm not buying it, and I'm not buying that they will either, because I think it would destroy the industry.
Well, I totally hear you around the, I think it would definitely funnel everyone who was still wanted to be in this game. It would funnel everyone down the same track. Everyone would just be basically complying with the regulation, and there may not be as much innovation. Although I think the counter argument to that would be people putting at the device market and going, well, there's tons of devices and they're very innovative, they're very different, and yet they all have to comply with the same sort of, the same set of rules. I do think, however, the tendency initially anyway would be to overregulate if they did, and it would end up being very meaningful use like to say it must meet these minimum requirements, it must do these things.
Yeah.
And so I think we would get sort of a quashing of the innovation for a while, but I also think it would kill off a lot of peripheral EHR companies that were on the edge.
So the regulations wouldn't be meaningful, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I just don't think there can be. Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't be very meaningful. It is interesting to think about, though, because, coming from the other side of it, the risk and the life and death nature of it. I mean, unlike a manufacturing software like an ERP or a CRM software, I mean, EHRs nowadays, they're plugged into so many different things. And now you're talking about the AI engines that are going on top of it that are making and helping to make decisions based on the data that they hold. You start to get into that area where I go, I'm actually kind of leaning towards maybe really you should look at that aspect of EHRs, because how good is that data really being entered? Who's actually looking at it to make sure it's valid before these engines start mining it and looking for patterns and things and making decisions, or whether or not to set an alarm on this high or that high, or you could see that EHR is getting there. So in my mind, one day it might have to take, it might need some serious consideration here just because of that aspect, not so much of the innovation quashing aspect of it.
Well, that is the question, and because we need something to ensure the safety of the technology that's being implemented. So, I don't know, and maybe this is something we could dive into a lot more in the future, but because as you start to look at where it's headed, okay, basic clinical decision support that's informing the doctor, the FDA has said we won't regulate that. But at some point, the AI is going to start diagnosing, right? Like the technology and the data is going to start diagnosing, and then the doctor is going to still be overlooking it generally. At least that's going to be a transition. And so who's going to regulate that the AI is diagnosing it properly? It's probably going to be the FDA. And so, we need that capability there, and we need to be thoughtful about how we regulate it, and, how we still ensure innovation, but also protect the safety. It's a challenging problem, and EHRs are getting there quicker and quicker every day.
Yeah, we hear about it all the time where there's a lot of medical issues caused by EHRs. And I don't want to say cause in the sense that it was on purpose, but because of the way a screen was laid out, or because of that fact that two very similar drugs are put side by side, and someone clicks the wrong one, it causes all sorts of downstream problems. But all of these things, you kind of start to think about, well, maybe there should be someone looking at this kind of information, because that's an error that would not have happened if there was proper design. But then they get into that quagmire of, well, what's proper design? Who's making that decision, right? So it's interesting, because I do think that, unfortunately, it's going to take a few more crisis situations before someone decides, hey, we really need to take a closer look at what's going on here at this industry, and especially around the EHRs themselves and the amount of intelligence that are put into them.
Well, and if you look at the macro view, some would say that the EHR is a relic that's going to be gone. I'm not sure I agree with them, but it is interesting to look forward and say, what could replace the EHR? And to me, what the thing that will replace the EHR will definitely be a FDA regulated device, because it will take something of that magnitude in order for the healthcare organizations to say, oh yeah, I'll get rid of this $1 billion purchase that I did, or $300 million, or however it is, and replace it with something else. It's going to have to be something so dramatically transformative that the FDA is going to be like, yep, that needs to be regulated because it's diagnosing or whatever it might be.
Awesome, John. Well, this has been fun, and that brings us to the end of another episode, another fun one. So thank you for all of you who tuned into this episode of Healthcare IT Today. You can find out more details about our show by checking out the programs page on healthcarenowradio.com. And please share your voice and engage with us via the community at healthcareittoday.com or on Twitter using the hashtag HITSM. I'm Colin Hung, and this is my friend and Health IT collaborator, John Lynn. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.